Thank you, everyone, for leading us that have been up here this morning in worship of our God. And good morning to everybody. Today we're going to look at the book of 2 Kings, chapter 5. If you have your Bibles, you can open up and you can follow along. I'll have the scripture up on the screen for us in a moment as well that we can read along with. And we're going to look into an interesting story. A story where a miracle will take place. Now, I did title my message this morning, Snow White and the Seven Washings, and you're going to see why. I thought it was funny, but that's just because I laugh at my own jokes. Now, yeah. Thank you, Peter. Anyways, how many of you, when having conversations with people in the community or in a wide variety of different places, where you have heard a common opinion about our politicians that sometimes they might not know how to do their job well? Has anybody heard those type of comments in the past? It seems to be pretty common, doesn't it? It's a common occurrence. Now, as Christians, I think we would love to see our politicians come to know Jesus, kneel before the Lord in prayer in the House of Commons. Yet we also know that will not happen unless they hear the gospel, turn from their wicked ways, and believe in faith in the person and in the death and resurrection of Jesus. In today's story from 2 Kings chapter 5, we are going to see not the politicians like we have in our parliament, but we're going to see the ineptitude of kings, the pride of a warrior, the greed of a servant, the faith of a young woman, the power of God, and the faith of God spread into other parts of the world. It's my hope that as we study this story this morning, that we would pray. To pray for our leadership in our towns, in our provinces, in our country, and in our world. God can do wonderful and amazing things through terrible circumstances. And He can change the hearts of the unbeliever, change the faith of His followers, or challenge the faith of His followers, and use the circumstances of life to bring about His will. So allow me to read our text this morning. 2 Kings 5. Now Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you so that you may cure him of his leprosy." As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he's trying to pick a quarrel with me?" When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message: "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to him to say to him, "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." But Naaman went away angry and said, "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot, and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned and went off in a rage. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, wash and be cleansed? So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. So please accept a gift from your servant." And the prophet answered, "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. "If you will not," said Naaman, "please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord. But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I have to bow there also, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this." "Go in peace," Elisha said. After Naaman had traveled some distance, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said to him, "My master was too easy on Naaman, this Aramean, by not accepting from him what he brought. As surely as the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him." So Gehazi hurried after Naaman. And when Naaman saw him running toward him, he got down from his chariot to meet him. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "Everything is all right," Gehazi answered. "My master sent me to say, 2 young men from the company of the prophets have just come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 sets of clothing." "By all means, take 2 talents, said Naaman. He urged Gehazi to accept them, and then tied up the 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 sets of clothing. He gave them to 2 of his servants, and they carried them ahead of Gehazi. When Gehazi came to the hill, he took the things from the servants and put them away in the house. He sent the men away, and they left. When he went in and stood before his master, Elisha asked him, "Where have you been, Gehazi?" "Your servant didn't go anywhere," Gehazi answered. But Elisha said to him, "Was not my spirit with you when the man got down from his chariot to meet you? Is this the time to take money or to accept clothes, or olive groves and vineyards, or flocks and herds, or male and female slaves? Naaman's leprosy will cling to you and to your descendants forever." Then Gehazi went from Elisha's presence, and his skin was leprous. It had become as white as snow. Interesting story, isn't it? There's a lot happening in here. So let's start in with point number 1 this morning, the cure. Naaman is the commander or field marshal of all the military in Aram. Now, Aram is located where modern-day Syria is found. It's to the northeast border of Israel. Notice what the text says about him. There are 3 really important ones, and then we'll get to the 4th one. He was a great man in the sight of his master. The Lord had given him victory to Aram through him, had given victory to Aram through him. 3rd, he was a valiant soldier. And then the 4th one that changes the way everybody looks at somebody when they get an illness. He had leprosy. It's like when you become ill in some way, people start to look at you differently. That's what you kind of get that picture here in this story. This last trait changes everything people thought about him. Now, they probably wouldn't want to mess with him on the battlefield. But this leprosy that he had was most likely just a cosmetic issue. The pigment of skin would have changed to be white. And because of his position that he had within the king's court, it wouldn't have been contagious. Otherwise, the king would have had nothing to do with him and would have sent him away. But this is where we face an issue. Aram was raiding the border of Israel. And in one such raid, this commander took captives. And one of those girls he took captive became a servant in his household. She was taken from her family and made to serve another. It was this girl and her faith who told Naaman's wife about a prophet in Samaria who would heal the disease. Notice how God used something absolutely terrible in this young girl's life and used it for something good. And also notice how far Elisha's reputation has spread. Elisha is now known as a healer, and it has gone everywhere. Now, when Naaman heard of this, he went to the king of Aram and told him about what his servant girl had said. And we can see how much the king valued the commander. This commander has helped him win all of these battles, right? So he's thinking, this is an important guy. So the king of Aram wrote a letter to the king of Israel explaining the situation, looking for a diplomatic solution, because they're kind of in a hostile relationship right now. The border skirmishes were kind of an issue. And so what the king of Aram did is he sent 10 talents of silver. Do you know how much that is? 750 pounds. Which was, by the way, 5 times the amount that it actually cost to buy the hill that the city of Samaria was built on. And you can see that in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 24. It only cost 2 talents of silver to buy. The king of Aram sent 10 talents of silver to help pay for this transaction to have his commander healed. He also sent about 150 pounds of gold and 10 cents of clothing, which would have been a tremendous payment for healing this man. One thing we should remember in this story is that the king of Aram would have assumed that the prophets of God served in the king's court. That's what he would have assumed. But what he didn't know was that the king of Israel was worshiping Baal instead of Yahweh. And the king was not in good relations with the prophets of God. So when he sent this letter requesting for this man to be healed, it came across the wrong way. The king of Israel misunderstood it and assumed that this was a manipulative scheme to justify more fighting and more actions along the border and more bloodshed between their nations. You can't heal this guy? Fine, we're going to fight you. Elisha heard about this letter and the king tearing his robes and requested that Naaman be sent to him. Most likely, Elisha was near the Gilgal area, and it's kind of where those food stories we talked about last week. By the way, I need to know, did anybody call your spouse's cooking death in a pot last week? I'm just asking. I did recommend not doing that, but sometimes people say, oh, Barry said don't, so I'm going to do that. I'm assuming that if anybody who did that didn't actually arrive safely to church this week. So in this particular area where Elisha was living, the Jordan River wasn't that far away, and so the Jordan was going to play an important part of the story. Naaman arrives at the proper location, goes to Elisha's home, assuming that he was going to be treated like an honored guest. He was sent by the king of Aram. He is bringing countless amounts of silver and gold. And Elisha doesn't even go out to talk to him. He sends a servant out with instructions. Go to the Jordan River, wash 7 times, you'll be fine. It'd be interesting. It would be nice if our doctors were able to say something like that, and maybe our healthcare system wouldn't charge 750 pounds of silver either for some things. Anyways, Naaman is supposed to go there, wash up, and what happens is he leaves in a rage. He didn't get treated with the proper respect. His honor and his pride was offended, and he was not treated as a dignitary. And he was supposed to be sent to the second-rate river to wash. Now, as he was leaving, eventually his servants called him to humility. And just reminded him, you would go do great things if asked. So why not do something simple? And so he relented. He humbled himself. And he went to the river, dipped himself in 7 times, and poof, he was cleansed. So what do you think is the most natural response for someone who has just been healed of a lifelong illness? How would you respond in this situation? What would you expect of this man, this commander of thousands upon thousands, and how he expected to be treated? Well, that's point number 2, the conversion. Naaman was cleansed. He placed his faith in Yahweh, and he went back to Elisha, and this time face to face. And he says an important statement. Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. Sometimes there are people who surprise us when they turn to faith. You probably have heard a wide variety of stories of famous people who have become Christians. There's one in particular I'd like to point out this morning, Chuck Norris. The iconic star of the hit show Walker, Texas Ranger, has been in many martial arts movies and TV shows and is easily one of the most famous people in Hollywood to have become a born-again Christian. Since officially converting, Norris has written a number of Christian books. He's been vocal about his belief that children in the American public schools should learn about the Bible and be educated in it. And there's also a whole host of jokes about Chuck Norris and his physical prowess. For instance, and I'll put one on the screen for you. Yeah, they're worse than my dad jokes, I'm telling you. Maybe not. Naaman tried to give a gift of gold and clothing to Elisha, which would have gone a long way because these people were struggling. Remember the famines, remember the lack of food. It would have helped to support the prophetic ministry, but Elisha turned it down. God's grace to him cannot be paid back with gold. The contrast in this story is striking. Naaman's arrogance in his expectations on how to be treated turned into humility. The man who had a servant girl now becomes the servant. His healing and his victories are seen in light of the power of God, not the might of a ram, nor the strength of the commander. His hostility towards the land of Israel and a second-rate river now changes to faith in God and that Israel's God is the only God. In his humility and faith, he requests to take dirt from Israel, most likely to make an altar back in Aram and offer sacrifices there. He also asks for forgiveness for the times when the king of Aram worships his God and he has to kneel there with the king. And Elisha's response to him was simple. Go in peace. And this is where we start to see another contrast. The story changes again. And point number 3, the curse. The rest of this story is centered on Gehazi. Now, if you remember, Gehazi was the servant of Elisha who helped when the Shunammite woman's son died back in chapter 4. Remember how he had to run ahead, lay his Elisha's staff on the boy, and nothing happened. He was running back, and you know the rest of the story. In this story, it might be easily seen that the curse that falls upon him at the end is leprosy. However, as one commentator put it, and I'd like to posit it as an idea, is that this is about the curse of envy. Envy plagued Gehazi's heart. And it led him to the inevitable plague of leprosy for him and his descendants. Naaman was humbled and healed. His conversion is a wonderful testimony. However, after this gift of grace from God was given to him and he comes to a place of faith in Yahweh, one of God's people used this opportunity to take advantage of the man's generosity for his own greed. Gehazi vows in the name of God to get something from Naaman. He uses God's name in this transaction. He prepares to lie and uses his master's name to pull it off. He asks for a talent of silver and 2 sets of clothing, but Naaman gave him 2 talents for each of the 2 servants he's referring to. A talent of silver is about 75 pounds. That's a lot of money. Whether he intended the money for himself or for the prophets, that is not the path that Elisha took. And through his deceit and misusing the name of God and Elisha's name, Gehazi receives a permanent mark of leprosy to remind him of disobedience, greed, and envy. Sometimes God's people are disciplined. We go the wrong direction, and God reminds us. C.S. Lewis, in his book Surprised by Joy, describes his conversion. It's a bit different than maybe what you would expect. And he writes this. He says, "You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalene night after night, feeling whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him of whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, May 22nd, I gave in and admitted that God was God. And I knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. I did not then see what is now the most shining and obvious thing, the divine humility which will accept a convert even on such terms. The prodigal son at least walked home on his own feet. But who can duly adore that love which will open the high gates to a prodigal who was brought in kicking, struggling, and resentful, and darting his eyes in every direction for a chance to escape? The hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men, and his compassion is our liberation. We all come to God one way or the other. We will face him in this life or in death. We respond either in faith or in rejection. Some hear a simple word and believe in the Lord. Others can receive miracles and blessings from God and still reject his existence. Naaman was willing to do anything to find healing. And in the end, the only divine being to ever answer his prayers was the God of Israel. In our story today, the miraculous conversion started with a little girl who was taken from her family and made to serve others in another nation. Her master actually believed her testimony about God and the prophet. The commander saw that the healing was found in an adversary, not in a friend, and made a plan with the king to seek his healing. The faithless king of Israel was helpless, but the prophet shone like a beacon as he brought God's grace. The commander was arrogant and did not want to be humbled, but his servants called him to humility. And the commander, whose job was to attack Israel, came to love the nation and took its very soil home because of his new faith in God. And the good news of Yahweh spread to another country. Today we are confronted with the conversion of a strong, powerful man who humbled himself and placed his faith in God. We are also confronted with the disobedience and envy of a man of God who ended up being disciplined. Which one are you? Are you like C.S. Lewis, who needed to finally allow God to be God of his life? Or are you in need of turning away from the sinful habits in your life that plague you, and at times may have long-lasting consequences? I'd like you to take a minute right now to pray for one of two things. Either pray and invite God to be God of your life, or evaluate your heart and ask God to reveal the things in your life that you need to repent of, to get rid of the evil actions, thoughts, and motives. So take a minute right now and pray. I would encourage you to keep talking to God about those things that are in your minds and in your hearts. Be honest with him, because he sees through the dishonesty anyways. It's about us being honest with ourselves. Is God my God? And what do I need to get rid of in my life that shouldn't be there? When reading this story, one thing that stands out to me is the sovereignty of God. He has plans upon plans to uproot Baal worship in Israel and to spread his holy name throughout the world. He even uses the unfortunate circumstances of a captive girl to bring about the conversion of a commander. I want to encourage us to see the world differently today. See it through the eyes of faith. That through any circumstance, God can bring about his will and glory. The circumstances may be annoying. They may even be dreadful. But do not underestimate the Lord of heaven and earth. I'm going to invite our worship team to come up at this time. They're going to share a couple songs with us in a minute. And some of our songs today testify about the grace and love of our God, who works within human history to bring about his perfect, loving, and holy will. Last week, I ended my message asking you, what is it that you need to trust God with? This week, I would ask the same question, but from a larger worldview. What is it in our world that you need to trust God with? This morning, as I look at the news, I see that the country of Iran sent an attack towards Israel. And the continued conflict between Israel and the Palestinians still rages on, even though at times it seems like it's coming to an end. I want to encourage us to pray for peace. Peace in that conflict. Peace in that area of the world. It seems at times that it's tearing itself apart. Hatred and violence beget hatred and violence. The loss of life is tragic, no matter whose life it is. It's another person created in the image of God who has died. And so pray for peace. And I would encourage you that if you would like to take time to pray about the war that's happening out in the Middle East, after church today, if you would like to go into our library and just sit in there and take some time to pray by yourself or with others that'll join you there, please do so. It would be good for us to be praying for peace in that area of the world. Let us see the world through the eyes of God and how his grace can reach the ones we thought would never come to faith. Let us remember the words of Jonah. He said, "I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity." And the city of Nineveh was changed during that encounter. Maybe, just maybe, our House of Commons, our Prime Minister, and all the politicians may one day know that Jesus is Lord. Keep praying for our nation, for our world, and its leaders.